in 10 minutes. When you think of World War II, you might be thinking of the Battle of Stalingrad but what about the Korean War? It was one of the most important conflicts of the 20th century that helped end the Cold War. In this series, we try to cover at least one important battle from every major war, but there are just so many battles to choose from when it comes to the Korean War. So I ask you, which battle would you like us to cover? Would you like us to do the Battle of Yelton, taking place in 1950? Or maybe you'd prefer to see the Chinese intervention in the winter of 1950, the Battle of Let me know in the comments below. And while you're down there, don't forget to leave a like for more epic historical tales. Now let's jump into the time machine and travel back to the early 1950s. In June of 1950, the Korean peninsula was divided between the communist North and the US-backed South, but the situation had been unstable since 1945. Both sides were massing troops near the border. The North Koreans wanted to unify the peninsula under communism, and the South Koreans and their American allies wanted to prevent this. This led to a situation where war seemed almost inevitable. On June 1950, North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel and began advancing south. They drove the UN forces back over the Han River in a matter of days. By July, Seoul had fallen and the UN command was in full retreat. They had hoped to establish a strong defensive line along the Han River, but they never really got the chance. As thousands of North Korean troops poured across the border, the UN forces fell back in disorder. This was a serious blow to the UN forces. They had expected the North Koreans to be less prepared and less determined than their enemies in Europe and Asia. They had been wrong. As the North Koreans pushed further south, the UN command realized they had to stop the communist advance. At the same time, they also needed to buy some time to get their own forces into the country. They decided to make a stand at the Choson area. This was a region with lots of hills and mountains, which made it easy to defend. The terrain also meant that both sides would have to move around on roads. This made it possible to cut off the North Koreans' supplies by destroying the bridges across the river. By mid-July, the 2nd Division of the U.S. Army had taken up positions along the Changchon River. They were holding the line against the North Koreans. The North Koreans had more soldiers and better equipment, but the Americans were able to hold them off. The fighting continued until August, when the North Koreans finally broke through the lines. The Americans were forced to retreat. They left behind all of their heavy equipment and most of their wounded. The North Koreans took tens of thousands of prisoners. The news of the American defeat spread quickly around the world. The Soviets and the Chinese they thought they had finally dealt a major blow to the Americans. But the Americans were not ready to give up. They regrouped and launched a counterattack. On September, the UN forces began advancing north again. They pushed the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. By October, they had retaken Seoul. The North Koreans were in full retreat, but the Chinese did not allow the Americans to pursue the retreating enemy. Instead, they sent in their own troops to stop the UN advance. In November, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops entered the war. The UN forces were caught off guard. They had not expected the Chinese to intervene. The Chinese fought bravely, and they were willing to endure great hardships to win. They pushed the UN forces back across the 38th parallel. By December, the fighting had reached a stalemate. The UN forces were exhausted and the Chinese were unwilling to risk another major battle. In January 1951, an armistice was signed. The fighting stopped. The war was over. When the news of the armistice reached Washington, President Truman was furious. He had been convinced that the war would be over by Christmas 1950. But it wasn't. The war had lasted for 2 years. And it didn't seem like there would be a clear winner. Truman decided he needed a new strategy. He replaced General MacArthur with General Matthew Ridgway. Ridgway was a career soldier who had experienced fighting communists. He knew that the only way to win the war was to fight the Chinese. He also knew that the Chinese were getting help from the Soviets. To fight the Chinese, Ridgway needed more men and supplies. He asked Congress for both. Congress approved his request. More men and supplies were sent to Korea. Ridgway's plan was simple. He would use the new troops to create a second front in the war. He would attack the Chinese in 2 places at once. This would force the Chinese to split their forces. It would also give the Americans a much-needed advantage. The plan worked perfectly. The Chinese were forced to move troops away from the front lines to defend against the new American attacks. This gave the Americans the chance they needed to push forward. By April 1951, the UN forces had advanced to within 15 miles of the Yellow River. The Chinese were in full retreat. It looked like the Americans were finally going to win the war. But then something unexpected happened. The Chinese counterattacked. They pushed the UN forces back across the Yellow River. The Americans were forced to retreat to the 38th parallel. The war was back to where it started. It seemed like the war would go on forever. Then suddenly, in July, the Chinese agreed to an armistice. The war was over. The fighting stopped and the prisoners were exchanged. The war was over. But the question remained, who had won? Well, it depends on how you look at it. If you look at the territory, then the North Koreans had won. The war ended with the 38th parallel as the dividing line between the two Koreas. But if you look at the casualties, then the North Koreans had lost. They had suffered over 500,000 casualties, while the UN forces had only suffered over 50,000 casualties. So who had won the Korean War? Well, the answer is no one. The war had been a stalemate since 1951, and no one was willing to risk starting another major battle. The war had become a low-intensity conflict. Both sides were still fighting, but they were not trying to win anymore. They were just trying to hold on. And that's where we'll leave this episode. Next time, we'll pick up the story of the Korean War, where we left off. With the outbreak of the Vietnam War and the growing anti-war movement in the United States, we'll see how the war divided the nation and led to the election of a new president. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below to let us know. You can also check out our other videos about the Korean War here.